Hey guys, you're listening to the We Could Make That podcast, and I'm your host, Andrea Ween. On this show, I interview small batch, independent food makers who've struck out on a noble cause, making the world as tasty as possible. In each episode, I'm digging into their backgrounds, motivations, and passions to decode why and how they started their businesses, and the lessons we can each take back to our own kitchens and lives. Let's get started. My guest on the show today is Laena McCarthy, the author of Jam On, The Craft of Canning Fruit, and the founder of Anarchy In A Jar, a small batch jam company in Brooklyn, New York. Anarchy's mission and tagline is to start a revolution in your mouth, something that Lena didn't set out to do, but is definitely living up to. Instead of going to culinary school like many in the food biz, she started out her career working for the National Science Foundation in one of the most remote places on the planet, Antarctica. We talk about her time there, how she started her business semi-illegally in the basement of a church, totally fitting given the name of her company, I think, and how the Brooklyn food world has changed since she came onto the scene. She also dishes out some advice for anyone looking to break into the food landscape. But even if you're not an aspiring maker, there's plenty of good stuff in here to sink your teeth into. So Lena, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. We were just saying it's bright, sunny Friday, hot and steamy in New York, but
Indeed.
Doing good. So I want to start off by asking you just a little bit about your food philosophy. So
Great.
What is your food philosophy? What's kind of and we'll get into why I'm asking this because your company name is pretty interesting too.
Yeah, that's a big question. Sometimes I feel like I could probably talk about my food philosophy for like many hours. But to sum it up, I think in terms of my food philosophy as connected to my company, it's about putting real ingredients in a jar and making real food accessible to people. One of the mantras of my business is and really how I started it was I grew up in the Hudson Valley outside New York City. And I grew up with a lot of relationships to small farms. And when I started my company, it really was out of the idea to make interesting flavors that were creative and fun, and to have the process of all of it be a part of the product. So, from having, fun tasting parties to having these relationships with farms. So the actual ingredients that are in the products are from local farms and I feel like reflect the taste of that. So, certain years our peaches might be spicier than others, and that's because of the climate or the change and all those relationships and things that affect the flavor of something. And I do think that it matters what you're eating. So I do think that the things and the stories that go into the ingredients actually do matter. I think they affect us. I think maybe you don't realize it when you're eating a piece of toast with jam. But I do think that on some level you do realize it, only because maybe it's not just the flavor, but it's also then the ability for people to, talk to me at all the different like events that we do and markets and talk about this stuff and talk about food and have that relationship to the product. And it's definitely a challenge sometimes to keep that philosophy going and also make money. But at the same time, I also think that's part of the challenge that keeps having a product that has a philosophy that keeps the challenge going. That's part of the fun part of it, is to actually force yourself to commit to whatever it is that is your mantra. So for us, it's, committed to using ingredients that have some sustainable, sense of relationship. And I think that matters also in terms of like, we don't just put labels on our product, right? So something like, as much as we totally believe in, I believe in organic farming, I also think that sometimes, especially in New England, near where we are, that's not always a reality. A lot of the farmers that we work with, their family farms are like 200 years old. They do stuff like integrated pest management, which is like it's a whole other level where they're actually doing farming practices that are sustainable, and but they also have, they might not be able to be organic because of the fact that they just don't have the ability to have that certification. And we love the fact that when it is a family farm like that, it means that, they have better labor practices, that they have, their workers are actually being paid a living wage and have a lifestyle, a life that's supportive. They aren't having, pesticides in their water, all those different things that actually do matter in terms of what goes into food.
Totally. Yeah. I think sometimes people get so caught up in this organic label, and now you're seeing kind of mass produced organic, which, arguably
Exactly.
is maybe not even better than conventional farming. So I think you're right that it's important. And it's so hard, I think, as a consumer often to make that distinction and really know where your food's coming from. So I think telling the stories of people, which is really what this podcast is all about, right?
Yeah.
Showing it's not about the labels, it's about the people and really what's behind why they do what they do.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting point you make. I mean, I think it's completely true. And I think that it's one of those things that is really challenging as a consumer, especially when you walk into a grocery store and it's kind of overwhelming. Like, even if you go into like a chic, small little grocery store somewhere, it still is overwhelming. I mean, theoretically, yes, if you go into a small like cheese shop, say like Stinky or Bedford Cheese in Brooklyn, like, yeah, you theoretically know that most of those products, like, those guys vet them and that they're like hand selected. But for many of us, when we walk into like a general grocery store, it is hard to know, like, how do you evaluate and compare products and understand them? And I think it does come down to, like, it is really helpful to have people telling their stories, or to like have that exposed and talked about a little bit more, so that there's a sense that you can know, like, what are you eating? What are you putting on what clothes are you wearing? Like, what do those things mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, sometimes people on the coast, New York, LA, Seattle, we kind of are a little spoiled for that kind of transparency, because we do have places like Bedford and Stinky and,
Sure.
green grape provisions and all those things. I grew up in Cleveland. And so it's like
Yeah.
exponentially harder in the Midwest and in some of those flyover states it's really tough sometimes to figure out when your only options are kind of the 7-Eleven, maybe a local market, but, you don't really know what's going on there. And then like the giant guys.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your company name, because I love it. Anarchy in a Jar. So how did you come up with that name?
Yeah, it's a funny story. So I actually came up with the name long before I had like an LLC or had actually started the company. I started making jam for fun with friends many years ago, and the first time I was really doing it, probably in mass, I was like 22 years old or something, 23, and I was making it one summer with a friend. We just kept making a lot of it. We were really into it, and we were coming up with all these interesting flavors. I was, going around and learning techniques from like old farm ladies and chef friends I knew. And I just started making product, and I used to tell people that it was so good. It was like Anarchy in a Jar. And it kind of became a moniker that I would say, a little bit tongue in cheek, obviously, but also it did kind of stand for what I ended up doing with the company as well, which is making these interesting flavors that also have this technique that I developed, which is like my own kind of thing, which is a combination of like a European style, or French style, where they macerate fruit. So they actually take the fruit and they macerate it with lemon juice and sugar it's a multi-day process where it kind of is cooled, and basically the sugar and the acid of the lemon juice start to break down the fruit and create some of that jamming process without heat. And then I kind of used in a more American style of jam making to using this kind of all natural citrus pectin that doesn't require sugar. So I add a little of that to it, which means I basically don't have to cook the jam for very long at all. And so what that does is it really means that the texture and the flavor is unique and it really tastes like fresh fruit instead of being something that's like super cooked down for 10 hours or something, which just has a very different flavor. So the way that the technique that I developed was to make it this product where it really tastes like you're eating a strawberry essentially, or you're eating an apple right then.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I grew up on Smuckers, it's
Yeah.
pretty much like sugar in a jar, or maybe even worse, like high fructose corn syrup in a jar. So I love that you're looking at new ways to be able to make something that we all know and love, but in a healthier and more delicious way.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you tell me a bit? So this has always been one of those things, like the difference between jams, jellies, preserves, marmalades. Like there's so many out there, and I think,
know, right?
Yeah, what's up with that?
Yeah, well, it's funny. So, each one of them has a different way, a different definition for sure. Jam definitely tends to be a term that's used as a blanket term for any preserved fruit. But in fact, if you're being specific, jam actually is fruit that has been smashed up with sugar, cooked down to a certain consistency. Jelly is strained pulp. So all of the pulp is strained out and it's just the juice of whatever that is. So, if you had a strawberry jelly, you would totally strain all of the pulp of that strawberry out of it. Marmalade is citrus. So any kind of citrus preserve is marmalade. So, you can have lemon, you can have grapefruit. Generally speaking, marmalades have a little bit of the peel in them. So you get some of that extremely bitter taste from the peel. Preserves are the proper term for a preserve is whole fruits that are suspended in their own juices. So you would have, instead of smashing up a strawberry, you would just have that whole little strawberry suspended in its own like jellied juice. Conserves are, technically speaking, jams that have more than 4 fruits and or nuts.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'm so much clearer now. So now I'm going to think of jams as like smoothies and jellies almost as juices.
Yeah.
Got it. All right. So
exactly.
Let's take a step back. So you mentioned that you grew up in Hudson Valley, which is here in New York. And what kind of, were you cooking as a child? Were your parents into food? Like, where did this love for good food come from?
Yeah, for sure. But both of my parents are avid home cooks in different ways. Definitely my mom was certainly the inspiration. She was the jam maker and she is a very avid gardener as well. So we grew all sorts of vegetables and fruits and herbs in our house. And, she definitely inspired me with the idea that you take whatever local fruit it is from your, say it's peach season, you take your peaches and you cook it up with some like lemon verbena or whatever is growing in the garden to make this awesome, like of the moment seasonal product that isn't just, peach jam, which is still great and amazing, but it kind of adds your own touch to it. And also kind of creates this awesome flavor combination. And she definitely inspired me in that regard. My father is definitely a more of the like adventurous. He was always, always had these like liqueurs that were going in the pantry, or he would make these like preserved cherries, or he made his own limoncello. His family's Italian, so he would make all these kind of Italian preserved boozy fruits that as a child were always very alluring because you weren't allowed to taste them, but you could kind of see the adults like drinking them late at night. It'd be very exciting. So I think probably I would say the combination of both of them definitely inspired me to be interested in food. And then I I did not go to culinary school. I did not follow that path, but I was working I was working for the National Science Foundation doing like science research support. And as I did that, I was traveling a lot. I was traveling all over the world. And so as I started to travel when I was young, I was 22 when I started doing that. So when I started traveling, it was really when I became exposed to this whole idea of food in a different way. Certainly, of course, that's at 22 is also when you're really like cooking for yourself and learning about all that. So as I was doing that, and it was always like I was cooking for myself, but in these like weird exotic locations as well. So it really taught me to kind of think about food and ingredients and think about them in this whole other way. And certainly I got really interested in the idea of things being preserved, partly because there is this sense of wherever you are in the globe of the idea of preservation being this way to kind of preserve the seasons and eat that food either, you know, when it's cold or when it's a different time of year and you want to kind of have that flavor, but you need to preserve it for later. So that sense of like capturing time in a product was really amazing to me. And I think that really inspired me to think about what a preserved product is in a bigger sense.
Wow, that's so cool. I have so many questions. Let's start with with where you were traveling. You said you were kind of going around to all these exotic locations, and I'm a big fan of getting out of your comfort zone and seeing different places, especially at like your early 20s, late teens, that time when you're really soaking it all in and trying to decide for yourself, like, what does my life look like and where do I want it to go?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I'm pretty much like, I'm like that boring old person now who like, when I like young people, I'm always like, get out there, travel. Like I'm definitely the like nagging them to do that.
Me and you both.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's one of the things in life I certainly that I do not regret for sure, is traveling when I was young and doing something that was, again, out of my comfort zone. I mean, certainly I was actually mostly working in Antarctica.
Wow, that's not what I was expecting.
So yeah, that's where I was working, but I would work like 6 months out of the year for the National Science Foundation doing science support, and I was doing logistics, which is super boring. I will not talk about on this podcast because it's dull, but certainly anyone has questions about logistics in Antarctica, you can certainly email me. But I will not bore you with them. But but it was awesome because I did see a part of the world that is pretty inaccessible. And I was also able to then travel, which is really hard, you know, when you're 22 and you don't have a lot of money. It's like, it was a great way to be able to like essentially be paid to be far away. Wow.
Yeah. So what was a typical dinner like in Antarctica?
Good question. Mostly pretty terrible.
It was just like London. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
kidding, English
all
people.
Of the food is... So Antarctica, to give a brief summary, it's a continent, you know, on the bottom. And the entire continent is set aside under an international treaty for science research. So there are no like civilizations. There never has been, actually. There's no native peoples to Antarctica. It is the only continent that has no people from it. It is because it's freezing cold and essentially uninhabitable. So basically through what it is the whole continent is set up with these research stations throughout the continent. It's a huge continent. It's like twice the size of, almost twice the size of North America. So it's big. And all over the continent, you have these little research stations. People fly directly, usually from their country, supported by their governments, to do their research projects. The Americans have the largest research station. Not surprising. They have 3 of them, actually. The main research station was where I was working. But you don't, you get planes. We flew in and out of New Zealand. That's the closest country to where the station was. But food is actually on the totem pole of things you're going to fly in on military aircraft. Food low on the totem pole, which, I know. Actually, it is really tragic when you're living there, though obviously makes a lot of sense, especially if you're listening and you're a taxpayer. You're like, yeah, I would definitely, like, your salad does not matter as much as, like, your science equipment. But yes, but because of that, essentially there's a ship that comes in once a year that brings, like, food supplies and all those
Once a
things and
year.
Band-Aids.
Wow.
Once a year. And then there are, fresh food does come in on airplanes. It just doesn't come in as often. So, maybe it'll be every few weeks you'll get these loads of food. So you do get fresh ingredients, not a huge amount. And then there actually is a greenhouse on the station. But because the continent is extremely tightly managed under this treaty, you are not allowed to bring soil into the continent. So obviously, right, microbes in soil could be very devastating to, like, a pristine, really isolated place like Antarctica. So it's actually a really fun, creative challenge. It's all hydroponic, the greenhouse. Hydroponic, like, but with no soil. So it's extremely hydroponic, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
So it's actually fun every time. There's always a person who's running the greenhouse. It depends on, when I was down there, it was actually a really cool guy who had studied agriculture at Cornell University. So he was really into, like, developing hydroponics and kind of working on, obviously, like, making really good vegetables. That said, they don't grow enough to really, like, fully support this whole station. But certainly you do get a little bit once in a while. You get at least some of your rations are, like, being grown there.
That's so crazy. I've never even really considered what they eat. What was the thing that you craved the most? Like, what were you like, when I get back, like, this is what I'm having?
So many things. Really it was fruit for me. I'm, like, a fruit nerd. I know that shouldn't surprise you at all since I have a jam company, but I do, like, love fresh fruit. I, like, really craved basically mangoes, avocados. Those are probably, like, the two things I crave the most.
All right. Well, at least you were close to Australia. Hopefully you stopped through there because they have fantastic mangoes and avocados.
Yes, exactly. No, it was amazing. And New Zealand was actually where we would go in and out of, but it was actually New Zealand has amazing food too. So it was amazing to land there after deprivation. I mean, that is a great thing about deprivation, is that you really appreciate abundance afterwards. So I always really appreciated my, like, salads and
So when you were 22 then, making jam with your friends, when did it jump from, okay, this is something that we're doing for fun, to wait, maybe I have something here?
Really good question. So a few years went by. And I was back in New York and was working for Pratt Institute, a university, actually, teaching, like, I was a digital archivist. So I was, like, doing a lot of long, boring stuff again. Feel free to email me. I won't go into detail. But on the side, I was still making jam and I was teaching it to people. Like, I would just, like, invite my friends to come along and I would, like, teach them how to make jam. And I found it was my kind of my therapy for working at a university, was to have this really, like, physical and tactile thing that I was doing as a side project. And then it was, 2009 and the recession was in full swing. And there was this sudden interest I found all around the city, more so than ever before, of people being interested in food and interested in, small batch food. And there was just this sense of people thinking about, like, eating again. Maybe it was something about that recession of us kind of going into this more intimate space of, like, food. But I think, but at the time I realized that there was nobody really making cool jam in New York. There certainly are, people like Beth, who makes Beth's farm preserves, and she's amazing, and she's upstate, and she's awesome, but she's, she definitely makes more, like, traditional jam, and no one was really doing what I was doing. And so I realized there was this, I had this interesting thing I was making, and that there was no one else doing it. So I had this opportunity, and I really started the business. I think both with the pleasure of making the product, but also just the curiosity of starting a business. And it was an interesting project and certainly challenging. But I started it out, and I would do these tasting parties. I would invite like food writers and just random friends, but also chefs and like anyone. I would just invite people to these parties, and I would sample. I'd have them taste all of my products that I was making. And this is before I was selling anything. This was just like my pre-game. And people would come. I'd have all these like little index cards. People would fill out their ideas and like things they liked, things they didn't like. And I actually really used that information to like get, a few products that I thought, okay, everyone really likes these. Let's start with these. And I started selling at these. There was this underground food market that existed. Rest in peace.
That sounds awesome.
Long gone.
Can we bring that back?
Yeah. So it was this really cool friend of mine, Joanne, who now has an amazing design company, fashion design company. She just started actually, so props to her that they're doing really cool stuff called Up, Down, Across. But when she first, this was years ago, and she was doing all these other things, she decided to start this food market because she, like a bunch of her friends, like myself, were thinking and like just had kind of started these businesses, and she realized there was this opportunity to kind of wanted to showcase them. And she really comes from like an art background, so I think she thought of it as like a gallery show, which is kind of cool because like I don't really think people think about food a lot like that. So it was a really interesting like segue of like art and food. And but she didn't really, it wasn't like really legal. I mean, it wasn't illegal. It was in a church. So I think her and the really amazing pastor who was there at the time of this church in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, realized that, just they kind of thought, oh, let's do this. It's in the church. So we probably are theoretically like kind of protected because it's like a church bazaar, which it was. It was like a church bazaar. But it wasn't like 100% legit, and that's kind of what made it charming, right? Was this like spontaneous thing. And what made it amazing though was that because it wasn't some like official big company starting it, it was like $25 to rent a table. And which meant that all these like blossoming food companies could totally afford to be there. So yeah, so it was this great opportunity. And actually like today, a number of companies, probably the legit core of people that are still making food in New York, we all, like a bunch of us got our start at that market. That's like where we started selling food.
That's very cool. I also love that there's a little bit of gray area and then legality, and your name has Anna in it. That's pretty great too, right? It just dovetails perfectly. It's like, yeah, that was meant to happen for sure. So 2000...
For sure. It definitely fit our brand. Yes, indeed. But, it was also an amazing opportunity because, it's just sometimes in life those things happen, right? It was just this timing where like it just so happened that there was this interest, I think, amongst people in the city, and therefore a bunch of us just kind of met that need by making these small companies. But then, of course, and what interestingly happened as well is like all these stores like Green Grape Provisions being a perfect example, an awesome shop in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. They are a small grocery, but they really wanted interesting products, and they were looking for that. And so this became a place where like all these buyers would come by and look for new products for their stores. So all of us really, like, our businesses instantly really took off because we suddenly had all of this demand. And, and really didn't have to do something like, in a traditional sense, a company would want to like, have a PR team or like do a marketing campaign. And, I was very fortunate to not have to really do any of that to start with. And I just kind of was making product and selling it at this market, and it just was getting picked up by all these companies. And so then, and of course, the press also came because it was an interesting story. So you had that combination, and then, out of that, all these companies blossomed. So
yeah, and in 2009, you were kind of in this first wave of Made in Brooklyn, right? It kind of took off after that, and maybe in large part because of events like this one, and because there was such almost a groundswell of excitement about this. Yeah,
for sure.
How has food changed since then, in your opinion?
I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think one of the challenges to, if you want to call it artisanal food, which I know is like a kind of abused word, but does actually theoretically food made by hand, small batch companies. I think the challenge of being a small batch company in a place like New York is just that it's a challenging environment. So you have a population that is hungry for new stuff all the time, which is kind of what makes it fun to run a company here. But it's also like what makes it a huge challenge because, and you have things like, since 2009, obviously things like Brooklyn itself and real estate has blossomed, if you want to say, or skyrocketed. So, it is really challenging to find places to make product in New York. I think that's probably the number one challenge for a small batch companies to stay afloat. And a lot of there's definitely a handful of companies that are still alive today that say started in like 2009 or whatever. It is actually extremely challenging to make it. And I think it's because of that, because New York is just a challenging environment. It's, it's hard to like, not only is it hard to find space to make it, but it's like, just like simple logistics, like getting tractor trailer trucks to pick your stuff up in New York. Like those are challenges. And like, we make it still at the same small facility we've been doing it at for like 6 years because like we just can't afford to move. It's just too expensive and we haven't found the right space. So finding a space that has like, the ability to have like loading docks and things like that is challenging. And so I think, that's probably, I think, the way in which like the market and the environment of New York has changed food. I think there's also a certain, even if it's not really true, there's a sense of saturation. So I don't actually think there actually aren't actually that many companies that are making food products in Brooklyn. There are certainly old school ones, right? Like you totally have your like old school like Chinese ramen noodle companies that are like still making it in their Bushwick warehouse. But like if you talk about like the new food movement, obviously like people who started like when I did, there's only really like the people that was doing it then are still doing it. There's a few of them that are still doing it now. And there really aren't that many people that are actually making it, but there are a lot of people that somehow find a way to put Brooklyn on their label. So maybe it's being made in like Tennessee, but you still are like calling it like Brooklyn, whatever,
Oh, that's a little annoying.
And so I think because of that, because the moniker of Brooklyn has become so popular, right? I mean, people have talked about this. There's like endless New York Times articles about like, Brooklyn, the label or whatever. But yes, the idea that I think because of that, there's this idea, people I think are a little bit bored of that maybe. I think there's a point where it's like, that, it only goes so far. I mean, as much as like, obviously there are still, when you're selling at events and like, dudes will come up from Germany and be like, Brooklyn means cool. It means cool. And you're like, thanks. Thank you. That's great. Yes. Yes. Okay. But, as much as that's obviously that impression is still there, I think there is a sense of like, because there are so many products that are like putting Brooklyn on their label, it becomes a little bit watered down, or people are a little bit overwhelmed by that saturation level. And I think it is, again, the press too. There's some sense of that being talked about a lot, even if it's not even really true, So I think there's maybe that I would say is the thing that has slightly changed, is that people are, again, it's been like a good 7 years of that idea of the Brooklyn brand being hot. And so it's like, how long can that really last for? But that said, I obviously that may change, but like, people still want to eat tasty food. So I don't think that will change anytime soon. It just is a matter of kind of like riding the waves of what people are craving, what they're interested in.
Yeah, and I think it gave people permission in a way to want that stuff across the country. Sure. So I think that's been the interesting thing too, is now there's all these small batch places popping up in Detroit or Austin or wherever. Totally. And even if they're not actually using that Brooklyn name, they're using that ideology. So
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice would you give to someone who is looking to start out? They're looking to start a food company, maybe in Brooklyn, maybe not. And they come to you and say, what do I do?
Yeah, people do. I actually like people email me quite frequently asking advice for that, and I'm like always happy to help them. I think it is. That said, it's really funny because like I vividly recall having a conversation with a guy. I probably had was like a year or two into my company, and he was a guy who has started multiple companies, and he was asking me all these questions. He was like, so, what PR firm do you use? What's your marketing strategy? How are you, all these questions that like, if you're going to start a traditional like food company, like in a traditional sense, how you start a company, there is a list of things that you should do. And I didn't do any of them. So maybe
again, anarchy.
Yeah, I didn't do any of them. So it's like, in a funny way, I'm like the worst person to answer that question, but maybe I'm also the best because of that, right? Where it's like, you know what? There aren't really any rules. That said, obviously, like there are certain rules that obviously if you're going to do a food company, like there are legal matters, right? Like you just obviously need to check with your local. Interestingly, food is regulated on a state level. So that's actually, it's weird and kind of freaky, not to like get people like, weirded out, but like it is a weird thing. I think it's weird where it's like food is regulated on a state level. So every state has completely different laws on completely different laws on how food is regulated. So health and safety of food. And it varies so greatly that it's surprising. For instance, in California, you can make food in your house. Like, so I could have a company making jam in my apartment, doesn't matter. Just like you have to go through like a certain, like a food safety regulation course in California. Anyone who makes like a product, a packaged product. But that said, then you can totally make something in your house, which
like your cat jumping on the counter.
Yeah, with your cat. Right. I mean, it's funny because people will always ask me like, "Oh, do you make it in your home?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Have you been in Brooklyn apartments before? Like, I don't know if you have, because if you have, you would know the answer is no. Yeah, so obviously that's also one of those things where it's like it would be impossible to make a product in your home and have a successful business. Like you just couldn't do it unless you were a very fortunate person with a large apartment in New York, which is like pretty rare. So that said, my advice to the only thing you really have to do is you have to like, register your company. So you have to like legitimately become whatever formation it is. Usually it's something like an LLC. Those are the only rules you have to adhere to. So like, you have to become an LLC, you have to pay taxes, and you have to like follow the food regulations of your state. But that is the only things that you have to do. Other than that, it really is like, I think the number one thing that I would always encourage people to do is just like be super passionate about whatever it is your product is. You can, of course, start a company and not be that into it and just have a really brilliant marketing plan or like a lot of money or whatever. But if you're thinking of seriously starting a company, I think having passion about whatever it is that you're doing is the number one thing that will sell your brand. And being able to be passionate and, and share that, because that kind of energy is infectious. And if you're passionate about it and you can tell people and talk to them legitimately about it, and then I think that that is like one of the keys to success. And certainly, obviously, also being savvy. So, finding ways to market your product that aren't necessarily traditional are great, right? Because the truth is, like, most people, we're so saturated in this culture with media that I think that there is a certain way in which, we're so used to seeing like smooth, sleek PR campaigns, right? And most PR companies, like even as great as they are, they work with a certain idea. So they all, things kind of tend to look the same. So I always encourage people, like if you're starting a company, be different, like be unique and work with what you have. So in a way, what's awesome is that, be like a really savvy Instagram user. So for sure, like get your product out there, take cool photos, like, but you can do that on your phone. You can like do that. You can share it. You can be out there, like, creating followings on social media. And you don't really need that sleek PR firm that's like taking cheesy, and in fact, it's actually better to do it yourself. Finding ways to, again, market your product. I was fortunate to have my like awesome underground food market, but those avenues still exist for sure. There is still cool ways to get your product out there. I had already had my company for a little while, but there's a food market in New York called Smorgasburg that started, and that was a great way for me to get my product out there. I was there. I was like one of the, there with the first booth sit down when they started Smorgasburg, and I did it for like 4 years, and it was great. It was a great way for people to sample my product, and you get free press when you do stuff like that, because people come and they take photographs, and like not only are they posting it on their own social media, but you have like, the bloggers and people coming and talking about it. And the more you can find yourself in those situations, the better. So if you can find, free press and free PR is like a great way to go, and thinking about it that way, which again takes a lot of energy for sure. But
I think it's just being authentic and not kind of trying to fit in, but just trying. And that word is so overused, right? Authentic, but like it's true. It's being who you are. So if you are starting some company and you're trying to fit into the Anarchy in a Jar model, like that's not going to work for you, because that's already taken. So I think people try to make things that look like other things instead of just being true to who they are.
Exactly. And if you look at who's successful and what they do, it's exactly that. It's people who like are authentic and original and like just kind of figured out how to do their own thing. And that's always interesting to people. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like we live in this oversaturated world. And so, as a manufacturer or a maker of something, the challenge, but also like what makes it fun is to like think outside the box, to like find a way to do something that actually is creative and like creatively position yourself to share that energy with people.
Yeah. If you could go back and tell 2009 Lena something, what would you tell her?
Good question. I would probably, I don't know. I'd probably be like, high five. Yeah, you're still doing it 7 years later. That's cool. I would probably encourage her to have the confidence to, say yes as many times as possible. I think that like, not to say that I haven't said yes, I did probably more times than I would have to like, say a big order or some, when I was like, for instance, the first year of business, Whole Foods came by and was like, hey, we want your product. And I was like, I'm like barely able to make enough to like sell at that point. Like I was already like way beyond my demand, right? So like I already was like, I can't fill any of my orders. Like I can only fill this many, or I can how to fill them. And, I said yes, which was a good decision. But, certainly I probably would encourage 2009 Lena to remember to keep saying yes and like figure out how to do it. So
cool. All right. I like it. So I just have a couple kind of quick fire questions if you're up for them. All right, cool. Yes. What is your ideal meal?
Good question. It totally depends on like temperature and environment. However, I absolutely love, no matter what, like a wonderful piece of like amazing bread. Like really good bread and like awesome butter is one of my favorite things.
That's a good one. I have celiac, so I'm gluten-free, so I'm like,
oh no,
bread. But yeah, I could see how that could
be. Just close your ears. I didn't say that.
All good. Favorite food city?
Oh, it's a good question. I was just in Pittsburgh for the first time, and it was a really cool food city. I was really into it. I thought there was like a great, cool, small restaurants. I was really excited by how many like small companies had started there, and it seemed like there was a great food energy. I was actually really envious of it because it felt like a place where people were really like legitimately starting small companies and taking them over. Also, somewhere I just visited that I was really into is Denver. Actually has a really cool food scene, food and beverage, I would say. But I was really amazed by like there was like a bajillion breweries opening, like so many that I was like, how is there this many people drinking beer? Like, I mean, but it was so cool. Like, it was like every other block there was like all the old factory areas had been like converted into these awesome, like beautiful warehouses with people doing stuff, and that was pretty cool to me.
Yeah, I was just there as well, and I was really impressed with the food.
Yes.
Besides jam, what else do you love to make? And it doesn't have to be food.
Yeah, I really love to, it depends. It changes all the time. I'm definitely like really into gardening. I really enjoy that, especially this time of year. But I do love to, besides jam, I'm really into like concocting my own like booze. So I have like all these wine experiments going on. I've been like working on creating these fruit wines, which has been really fun. It's like it takes time because they have to age and stuff, and ferment, and but that's a really fun process. I also have a 10-month-old baby, so I've been like really into like making her food, which has been really fun.
If you need anyone, I'm right down the street in Brooklyn for the fruit wine testing or babysitting. Sweet. Either one. I'm up for either. That works. And then the last question here is, what's next for you guys? What's next for Anarchy?
Yeah, we are in the process of looking for some space. We have a few projects going on. We're looking to do a little bit more of a like storefront. So, one of the things that's been really fun about Anarchy over the years is we do a lot of like teaching classes and stuff. And so we're looking to do more of that in our own space. So having a space where we can like sell our own product and have classes and, create a little more of a community space around what we do. We found that that's kind of what people are looking for. And I think it's like what we're looking for a little bit too in terms of being in New York. So
that's great. Thank you so much. This was awesome. It was so, so good to talk to you. Can you let people know fun to talk to you. How to get in touch with you?
Anyone can email me. My email at the company is ladyboss@anarchyinajar.com.
Love it.
But you can just go to anarchyinajar.com too. You can contact us. There's a, contact us page. And we love to hear from people. Like, we love any questions, I always say I have you can ask all the jam queen questions, and we will happily answer not only your jam making, but any questions you have. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and weekend. And
thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you're enjoying it, please go to iTunes and rate and review us. It would mean the world to me. And don't forget, you can check out the show notes for Lena at wecouldmakethat.com/anarchy. Have a good one.